And welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading Patricia St. John Tells Her Own Story by Patricia St. John with permission of 10 of Those Publishing Company. And we are on Chapter 16, Nephews and Nieces. Farnham and Janet's 6 children were a continual source of occupation and pleasure. Soon after he married, Farnham decided to build his own house with much local help. It was a stone's throw from the nurse's home and at the bottom of the hospital compound. A small house on the cliff top with large windows looking directly across the Straits of Gibraltar. At first it boasted 1 large bedroom and one tiny one with bunk beds for Paul and Oliver. Over the years, these 2 children were followed by 4 more: Claire, Danny, Martin, and David. Later, the 2 dear grannies joined the family. At each addition, the house grew a little larger as other rooms of various sizes and shapes were added to it. This house became a center for Moroccan Christians, medical students, visitors of many nationalities, hippies in distress, the sick and needy of every description. In the middle of all this, the children grew up, also with a good deal of local help. They had turned out loving and caring people and looked back to that crowded little house with nostalgic pleasure. One of the English nurses, Gwyn Thatchton, working at the hospital during this time, wrote the following limerick, which illustrates the house's varied uses. It was to celebrate Farnham's completion of a sofa settee to use in the sitting room. Farnham also had a reputation for driving the old hospital van and his ramshackle motorbike way too fast. There was a young doctor called Sinyon who said, "It's my honest opinion that given the flues, which is money, and plenty of juice, which is petrol, I could make my bike go like the Winyan. It's my intention to make with a sort of invention a settee that expands to meet the demands of the house by the sea at 2:45 when folks come to tea. There'll be room, don't you see? There'll be bishops, and mishes, missionaries, and other strange fishes, a jumbly or 2 and a hippie with flu, a baby with measles, another with sneezes, for they all come to tea at 2:45. Do come and join us then." Children attract children, and the place swarmed with them. The smartly dressed offspring of American missionaries, businessmen and diplomats, the scruffy older brothers and sisters of the milk clinic babies, they were welcome indiscriminately and played endless noisy games on the old tennis court at the bottom of the garden. We had the use of a battered old van and later a car. And I remember a Saturday afternoon in the spring going, as we often did, into the country for a picnic. From January till April, the hills behind Tangier are glorious with wildflowers. The first heavily scented narcissus, then the blue irises and mellow small crimson gladioli and marigolds and buttercups and multicolored bitches. Farnham's children loved to join the girls and me on the flower-gathering expeditions. Paul had an endearing lisp, and I can see him aged about 3 squatting on a patch of emerald green grass, munching a handful of it. "Paula eat grass," he was murmuring to himself. "Paula die. Paula eat more grass. Paula die more." Provincially, though, Paul did not die, but lived to go back to Morocco after his medical training in UK as a surgeon in the government hospital. I remember David at 6 years old, apparently possessed of a devil, suddenly rushing from his flower picking to the van, jumping in and taking off the brakes. The van, parked on a hill, took off pretty smartly. I was some way away, and there was nothing I could do about it but stand and pray. Possibly the worst moment of my life passed in amazed wonder as I watched the van turn gracefully and come to rest in a ditch on the other side of the road. And it wasn't David steering either. Oliver was the perfectionist and poet. At Christmas time he had to have his own tiny tree as well as the big family one. He would spend hours decorating and gazing at it and lighting the candles in the dark and seeing who knows what worlds of beauty and joy. But he also liked to live by rule, and he hated to be 1 moment late for school. He would ask me the time every few minutes. Once when I was working I failed to look up and merely saying it was still quite early. There was a grievous silence, and then he remarked, "Auntie, I do wish she would take life more seriously." Claire, the only girl of the 6, and thus especially precious, she had the distinction of being the only one forgotten and left behind on a seaside picnic several miles from home when she was 3 years old. When Janet arrived back at the house and counted the children as they jumped out of the van, her own and others, Claire was missing. Very agitated, she went back to the beach where at half an hour before they had packed up the picnic, find a contented Claire sitting on the old road sweeper's lap, sucking on a boiled sweet. She was not in the least worried, for were not all the Moroccans Daddy's friends, and would not Mommy for sure come back to fetch her? Danny had a vivid imagination, and it was hard to tell whether the amazing adventures that he related so charmingly had really happened or not. He had a wonderful knack of saying the right thing and cheering everyone up. I once traveled to England with him, and we were staying a night with friends in Madrid. It was blazing hot, and the plane had had to make an emergency landing in Seville, so it was midnight before we finally reached Madrid airport. I carried a sleeping Danny to our host's car, almost too tired to speak. The kind host who had been waiting for 5 hours seemed to be in a similar condition. When we finally reached the car and staggered into it, it would not start. We had to leave it and continue the journey in a taxi through the dead suburbs of Madrid, passing through the dark gray street after dark gray street in the early hours, when even Spaniards were asleep. Danny suddenly woke up. "Where are we?" he asked. "In Madrid," I replied drearily. He peered out the window. "Then I do think Madrid is the interestingly place I have ever been to," he exclaimed enthusiastically, and somehow the fog lifted. Martin and David, the two youngest, were inseparable. David was the leader of a gang of little Moroccans. There was one rather disreputable family of 6 small children who were flooded out of their home near the beach and took refuge in our basement. They all seemed more or less the same size, pasty-faced and underfed. But Martin and David loved to spend the evening drinking mint tea with them. During the day they would pour into the garden below the doctor's house and roll down the grass slope with shrieks of laughter, repeating the performance again and again. David never seemed tired of rolling with them. Martin would join in for a time, but enough was enough, and I remember him marching into the house, flushed and with grass in his hair, remarking with great vehemence, "It's not that I don't like David, but I do, because I do. But I do wish there was just one person out there who had some brain." I started a Sunday evening group known as the Young People's Fellowship for English-speaking children. We always started off with biscuits and Coca-Cola, a rare treat in those days. David, aged about 5, was allowed to join us for the refreshments and singing, and was an enthusiastic member of the group. One day he came up to me looking thoughtful. "Auntie," he asked, "could we have fellowship, just you and me alone?" I was delighted. He was such a merry little clown, and perhaps something more serious had penetrated. I asked him when the fellowship should take place. "Tonight," he said, "when I am in bed in my pajamas. Just me and you." I arrived in his room with the children's Bible under my arm. He was sitting up in bed waiting for me. He gazed at me suspiciously. "Where's the fellowship?" he asked. It took me a moment or two to realize my mistake, and I fled and, parking the Bible, ran to the corner shop for a bottle of Coke. We spent a happy but secular half hour. Fellowship was a Coke. Nothing more, nothing less. I remember journeys with some of the children. There always seemed to be a good many of them. The journeys were taken on the whole lightheartedly, and on one occasion, traveling across Europe, we stopped late one night in Spain. We laid the sleeping children in their sleeping bags in a row on the moonlit field, and we adults stretched out beside them. We did not realize that because of the heat, Spaniards dig their beetroots by moonlight. We woke to find ourselves surrounded by a startled, noisy group of Spaniard laborers, wanting an explanation. And when they saw the sleeping children, they were all kind and courteous. De nada, it is nothing," they cried, waving their hands, and they dug their beetroots, weaving around us till sunrise. Family was fortunate. The children grew up in that happy era when the government paid boarding school fees for the children of British couples working abroad with a salary under the minimum limit. One by one, age 9, they left for school in the UK. The most exciting days of the year were when the family and any of the girls off duty would go to the airport to meet the plane, bringing the big children home for the holidays. The girls were considered part of the family, and we would travel in convoy to the airport. I remember the little flying figures rushing across the tarmac, clutching collapsing parcels, and especially at Christmas time. I remember the embarrassing noise of the reunions, only no one was embarrassed. David triumphantly at getting his handmade wooden bookend safely through customs. I packed him right in the bottom of my suitcase. The customs man never even saw them, he exulted gleefully, as though he had successfully transported a bomb. Every small accomplishment was aired and appreciated and new experiences shared. A special family concert was given for Paul, who had been learning the piano for one term. Paul will now play a piece, said the announcer solemnly. Paul will play, was the spirited reply, and he proceeded to do so. Farnham and Janet excelled in picnics and took the children camping during the holidays. Anyone who liked could join in the fun as they pleased. I doubt if there is any more beautiful beaches in the world than those of either side of Tangier. I can never decide which I like best, the Atlantic side with the endless golden sand stretching all the way to Rabat, huge breakers and rocky cliffs, or the soft Mediterranean coast with the little inlets, calm blue sea, and clear, transparent water. There were lonely roads to the district, far off the beaten track, where even a 12-year-old could learn to drive the car in safety on sick visits to the villages with Daddy. Sometimes there was a feast to partake of on the arrival of a sheep, roast sheep or fowl, freshly slaughtered for the occasion. Weddings and feasts, such as that celebrating a baby's birth, added color and gaiety to life. I remember an occasion when the hospital staff were invited by a grateful patient to spend the night in his village and to be present at the final marriage celebration of one of his relatives. We were to witness the departure of the bride at midnight to go to her husband's house. The older nurses found plenty of reason to refuse the invitation. It was blazing summer weather and a long journey. But Farnham and I thought we could take the girls who were eager to accept, and we set off one afternoon with our guide, Paul and Oliver tagging along too. We drove in the old hospital van until the path petered out, and then we left the van with the guardian and set out on foot. It was one of those villages which was near, so near, just over the next hill. But the next hill reoccurred 6 or 7 times. An old familiar story. It was nearly sunset when we arrived, sweating, exhausted, but the feast revived us. The bride went off around midnight to a deafening burst of lutes and tambourines, and we lay down where we could and slept soundly. We had intended to leave at dawn and reach the van before the sun really gathered strength, but it was not to be. The sick of the village had already gathered, and Farnham had to conduct quite a long outpatience before they served us a ceremonial breakfast. It was blazing hot before we were allowed to leave, and we walked slowly while the sun rose higher. We had trudged some miles when Paul suddenly collapsed. We were not far from a little village, and we laid him down and covered his face. But there was no shade, and our water supply was nearly finished. A river bed lay ahead of us, but the river had dried up. To our left was a collection of mud huts, hardly a village, and someone hurried there to ask for a loan of a donkey. They were kind and concerned, but they could not help. Every donkey had gone to market early that morning, and there was not a beast left in the place. There was nothing to do, nothing for it but to try and carry Paul, a sturdy 9-year-old, between us and stagger on. It was then, at that time of real danger and need, that we learned afresh, as we have done over and over again, the truth of God's promises. Just as we prepared to move on, we heard the sound of little hoofs, and a small donkey driven by an old man rose up out of the riverbed a little further on. The man had been gathering rushes and had tied them in 2 neat bundles on either side of the animal's flanks, forming a perfect mattress for a child to lie on. He was only too happy to earn some extra money and laid his great straw hat over Paul's head and shoulders and set off merrily. Before long we came to a riverbed that had not dried up, and Paul was laid in the pool and revived, after which we all splashed in the water too. It was rather warm and muddy, but we were not fussy, and we traveled on homeward praising God for his provision. The old man was happy too, rewarded beyond his expectations. Tomorrow will be chapter 17, Questions People Ask. It sounds like a good one. I like that. I love you. I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.